Hello, good afternoon. DuEwa Frazier here. I'm just going to go ahead and pin my guest name today. Cannot wait to talk with her, Dr. Regina Bradley, to discuss her new book. So I'm just going to pin this and hope some of you will be here to join us for this wonderful conversation on hip hop. I hope I'm spelling this right. Chronic. Let me go back. Chronicling Stankonia. Okay, so let's pin this. And I'm going to tag, there she is, Dr. Regina Bradley. Let's go ahead and bring Dr. Bradley on and give her introduction. Greetings. Good evening, Dr. Bradley.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And I can see you as well. Thank you so much for joining me, taking time out of your busy schedule to be here on Nerdacity podcast on IG Live. I love to read your biography before we get started and make sure folks who are listening know exactly all of what you're doing and, you know, what you've been up to with your scholarship and writing and everything.
Awesome.
Dr. Regina N. Bradley is an alumna of the Nasir Jones HipHop Fellow, Harvard University, spring 2016, and she is an associate professor of English and African Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia. Her experience and research interests include post-civil rights African American literature, hip-hop culture, race and the contemporary U.S. South, and sound studies. Dr. Bradley earned a BA degree in English from Albany State University in Georgia, an MA in African American and African Diaspora Studies from Indiana University Bloomington, and a Ph.D. in African American Literature from Florida State University. Dr. Bradley is the author of Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South. The book explores how Atlanta, Georgia, hip hop duo OutKast influences conversations about the Black American South after the Civil Rights Movement. She is also the editor of an anthology, I believe it's out already, OutKast and OutKast Reader for the University of Georgia Press. Both projects stem from Dr. Bradley's work on her critically acclaimed series, OutKasted Conversations, a YouTube dialogue series about the impact of OutKast on popular culture. Welcome, Dr. Bradley, and thank you again for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So first, I want to congratulate you on this phenomenal work. I'm just like, wow, the way you weave in not only the history of hip hop, tying it into Southern culture, dialects, pre and post civil rights, you talk about Jim Crow, but then you give us these almost like, you know, it's a memoir of your own life and how you connect to being a part of this generation, watching the rise of these artists and how it impacted your life, your language, your perspective, and then of course now you being a professor of English, and it all ties together. So fantastic. I'm so proud of you and so in awe of what you were able to accomplish, even while pursuing all these degrees and teaching. It's like, girl.
Ciao.
I won't even ask you how you did it. because we know we do it, but you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just I don't know. Sometimes I look back and I'm like, I don't know how I did it, but I know that when I was writing the book, I intentionally wanted it to not sound overly academic. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And making, a subject like OutKast that's so beloved to so many people, including me, but it was also like, I don't want to over academize them to the point where I don't want to write it, but also
Right.
but I also wanted to make sure the people that enjoy it and love them as much as I do were able to at least kind of see how they contributed to this larger conversation about Southernness and race and experiences from somebody who experienced it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of academics is that we're told or trained even to not center personal experience. But a lot of the things that we study are based on a personal experience. Something happened to us.
True.
Like, okay, I need to explore this further, research this further. So it was really, I'm really glad that it all kind of came together the way that it did.
And what I love about it, and you mentioned center the conversation, is that it reads like a conversation. You feel like, as a reader, I was totally expecting a more, as you mentioned, with a certain academic tone and that, and, with the vocabulary and very academic discussion of vernacular and all that kind of stuff. And you do that, but you do it in such a way that people can go back in their memory. If you are a part of this generation, hip hop generation, and you remember how OutKast came up and everybody was like, who is this? I mean, they have a different sound, a different style. Like, it takes you back the way you're writing about it. And then how you're linking it, you're bringing it up to the whole trap music, trap movement, and discussing that. And then that's making me reflect on, okay, then we had T.I. and we had 2 Chainz, and of course Jermaine Dupri was really that producer and that figure that seemed to be like holding it down for the South, while all the New Yorkers were over here, Diddy and all of them, and then you had Dre and them on the West. So it's like, so who got the South? And you really discussed that very well and really put it in a whole, like, okay, so this is how all this came about, and this is how they're all kind of connected, and then this is how it's connected with our culture. And it's, so please tell me how you were able to, once you decided, I want this work to be so accessible, in terms of not only academia, but just folks who love hip hop. How did you determine how you were going to organize all of this, the facts, the history, the genres of, you talk about some subgenres of hip hop. How did you do that?
Lots of prayer. No, I mean, initially, when I started writing this book, it was because I saw a need, right? Like, it's not like studying hip hop in the academy is something that's new. It's actually knocking on 30 years in 2024 with the 30th anniversary of Black Noise, right? But what I saw was that there was, I mean, for some folks, it might have been intentional, but there was a complete overlook of the contributions of the South to hip hop culture. And a lot of it overlapped with this kind of expectation about Southern Black folks that was like, oh, well, they don't really have their own culture. They don't really have anything that can contribute. And I'm like, yeah, okay. You know what I'm saying? So when I started writing the book, I was writing it from a petty place. So
okay.
Like, I was like,
it's almost like revenge, like
not revenge, but also the sense that I just kind of wanted to shut people up, in terms of, okay, hip hop started in New York. That's fine. That's good. Howsoever, it didn't stay in New York. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Root. I'm country, so it took root different down where I'm from in Albany, than what was happening in the boroughs. And there wasn't any kind of context for why that was significant. or there was very little context. Like there were Southern hip hop journalists who were talking about the music, but academically, there's very few books about, you know, this is what Southern hip hop does. This is what Southern hip hop is. Or if there was mention of the South, it was in such a, not necessarily a condescending way, but there wasn't enough to be like, oh, okay, there's a unique contribution. Right. You know, you brought up like Diddy and JD, and I was laughing because of this recent live that they did where it was like Diddy said he didn't have enough hits. And I'm like, bruh, you clearly, even with all your connections to the South, even with all your connections to Atlanta, you really fixed your face. They'd be like, Jermaine Dupri couldn't go hit for hit with you. Go on now, go on.
Right. Because we, you know, he or others may forget Jermaine Dupri. When I think about Jermaine Dupri, I think hip hop, but I don't just think hip hop. Like all the work he did with Mariah, and then he did work with Janet Jackson, and he has really and then all from that place of Atlanta, we know that that's been his base. So
there's a reason that it's so deaf, you know what I'm saying? And at one point in time, this is for all the old heads who are here from Atlanta, you coming into the city, you see the so deaf welcomes you to Atlanta. It wasn't Bad Boy, it welcomes you. It was so deaf welcomes you to Atlanta. So I mean, like, I think that it was a disservice. It was this low key diss, right? That
true.
I mean, like, it really kind of, I don't know, I was kind of shook, but even then, I mean, like, Atlanta is such a unique place in terms of musicality. A lot of folks know Atlanta now for, you know, its hip hop scene, its trap scene in particular, you know what I'm saying? But I mean, like, if you, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the introduction of the book, if you really are put on game about why Atlanta is significant to popular music, they were also a funk capital, right? Like my first introduction to Atlanta's music scene was through my dad and his, you know, all of his cameo and Gap and SOS Band.
I love your narratives on that. That was fascinating to read. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so then, you know, Organized Noise took its lead, so to speak, from the influence of the funk music aesthetic, which separates it from what New York was pulling from. True. But still, you know, there's still these assumptions that are being made that the contributions of Southern artists aren't on the same level as those from New York or anywhere else. And as a staunch Southerner, and as also as somebody who studies the culture, I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, it's kind of like, just like, it's like that. It's whatever. And I'm like, you know, you have to put OutKast in conversation with your Nas's and your Wu-Tang Clans and all of these folks, right? Because they introduced the possibility, one, of hip hop being urban below the Mason-Dixon line, but also, like, this is how we took hip hop and make it ours and make it unique.
And is it, you know, and I'm trying to recall certain things too, you know, placing people in relationships with one another. When I think about OutKast, I still somewhat think about Goody Mob and Big Gift and all those folks. And that I thought I read or heard that they were somehow friends or had worked together, even though we don't consider them in terms of albums, like, oh, that they're all one group. But I feel like they're in the same, you know, time period.
I mean, you have to, because Goody Mob is part of the Dungeon family, just like OutKast is, right? And for the folks who are uninitiated, I mean, the Dungeon family was that group of artists, the collective that worked with Organized Noise, literally in the basement of Rico Wade's mama's house, right? So there was like all these folks going. And I mean, like, you know, from the documentary to Art of Organized Noise to just interviews in between, there was a reason that OutKast was featured so much on Goody Mob, or Goody Mob was featured on so many OutKast albums. They were literally there coming up together, right? But the interesting thing about Goody Mob is that they were so Atlanta-centric, which means like they were focusing so much on Atlanta's scene, Atlanta's society,
right?
That OutKast didn't necessarily have to do that. They were more of a broad interest, I guess, if you will.
It seemed that way. Yeah.
I mean, like, no less talented, but just, you know, the direction of the group was different. So that when OutKast does come out, like, what they were talking about aligns with Goody Mob, and especially in the earlier albums where they're talking about Atlanta as this post-civil rights city and the idea that there is such thing as a contemporary space, right? But with what OutKast continues to do with their discography is that they welcome this idea of experimenting with the possibility of what does it mean to be Southern and Black. And that continuously evolves, not only in how they present themselves as Southerners, but also what they think that sounds like. The way that they sound on Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music is totally different by the time that we get to, Speaker Box and The Love Below.
True indeed. And I was going to ask you, I mean, I don't even know if this is appropriate. Again, when I think about music, I think about relationships and peers. I think about also Erykah Badu right around that time coming out. Sometime I want to say the mid 90s, if not by 96, 97 with her album. And then we know that there was that relationship between her and Andre 3000. And I wondered, everyone said that she impacted his style, what we see visually. But I also wonder how might she have impacted OutKast as a whole with sound and subject matter themes of their music. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I always say that, Badu finishes off what Andre was starting before that. I mean, you definitely see kind of like this raise in awareness, so to speak. But I mean, even before Erykah Badu, Andre was already going through his woke stage, so to speak. So I mean, at the 95 Source Awards, he arrives in his purple and white dashiki. You know what I'm saying? By the time we get to this, he's wearing the turbans, right? And by the time that we get to, when folks are all up in his and Erykah's Badu's business,
right? Yes.
Up in their business, right? I mean, I feel like he pretty much had a sense of self, and being in a relationship with Badu just amplified that, right?
I appreciate you making those statements, because I think for people on the outside looking in who may not be native to the culture, Atlanta or New Orleans and surrounding parts, we may not fully understand, well, what came first and what was parallel and what came after. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think. And I think it's even more interesting now when we think about the state of Southern hip hop currently, because there isn't as big of a need or as urgent of a need to represent for the South in the way that previous generations of Southern hip hop artists did, right? Because we have social media. So it's like, if I want to sound like I'm from Atlanta today and I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, I can do that. If I want to sound like I'm from, I can pick and choose, right? But I think the other thing that's important to understand about the earlier generations of Southern rap is that everybody was kind of doing their own thing, and that is so important. So the way that Atlanta was sounding with funk, for example, is different than what was happening with bounce in New Orleans or chopped and screwed in Texas. I mean, we're in conversation with each other, you know what I mean?
And I think up north, I'm like New York / Midwest. I grew up in both places, but I think we tend to at times have lumped all Southern sounds and all Southern artists together, as opposed to, as you mentioned, this is New Orleans, this is Houston, this is ATL. You know what I mean? And then, I appreciate that, because it gives each region the respect due and the subgenres, as you mentioned in your book.
Yeah, and it's just and to reemphasize that, it's like the South, everything isn't universal in the Southern experience. There are multiple threads to that, right? And I think that acknowledging the threads does more service in terms of actually showing how sophisticated Southern hip hop culture and Southern hip hop rap can be. It's like, we can find these different ways to adapt. And I think that's a distinguishing factor that often gets overlooked in conversations. And it's also one of the reasons I kind of hate conversations with folks who try to list the best of, you know what I mean? Because
do people ever ask you when you're being interviewed, so Dr. Bradley, top five MCs. All right,
I don't do them because it depends on, you know what I mean, what age I was. You know what I mean? Right. Like when I was a teenager, of course my top 5 is going to be, who I was listening to at the moment, which then was OutKast. It wasn't 1 and 2. They were a duo. Like, I don't understand why folks try to tear them apart. But anyway,
they love to do that. Yes, they do.
I hate it. I hate that folks try to, tear apart the genius. That's the reason that they were so genius, is that you pull from one aesthetic and the other and you combined it together. Compared to, now I don't necessarily have one. You know what I'm saying? It's different. It's not that I don't think folks are great, but what I'm seeing when folks do these lists is folks don't want to be honest and be like, these are my favorite artists. Say that it's your favorite artist. You know what I'm saying? That's not
right.
from the talent, but folks like try to justify it, well, because they weren't doing this and they weren't doing that. But I'm like, yo, if your top 5 is your favorite, just say your top 5
is your favorites, right? I think people are afraid to be criticized, when it comes to that. And I've listened to so many radio shows that discuss it, podcasts, different people, they argue, debate, go back and forth.
Yeah.
People have who they believe is elite. Some people only name New York rappers. That's
it.
Another thing. Some people only go regional. The top 5 can only be from over here.
I'm thinking because the reason, what I'm saying, is because it's like, of course it's only going to be New York folks, because that's where New York started, or that's what you were listening to whenever,
right.
You know what I'm saying? But again, the bias that's associated with it. And what's fascinating now is that, like, even if we acknowledge somebody like an OutKast, right, they still, like we were saying earlier, there's still a need to separate the talent. Because folks feel like because they have such a visceral response to an Andre 3000, that makes his bars harder than a big boy who's
right.
storytelling. You know what I'm saying? And Andre touches our spirit in this way because there's such an emotional reaction, an emotional way that he delivers his work. It's so interesting. Right? Where Big Boy is like, I'm gonna show you what I see. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that Dr. Fredera Hadley really put the nail in the head a couple years ago when we were on a panel. She was like, Big Boy tells a story and it unfolds in front of if it unfolds in front of the listener in the ways that with Andre's verses, they don't unfold like that. You have to sit with them.
Right.
You know what I mean? So like, with this recent verse that he released, this unreleased verse that he did with Kanye
Kanye West, right?
There's a reason that we keep going back to it because there's so many different things we need to catch up on.
Deep. Yeah, for sure.
Did he really say his mama was in a blade of grass and when his skin itches, that's her telling him to get going? It's like I don't want to say it's levels, but there's layers to it.
Layers, exactly. That's right.
You have to give them multiple listens. You know what I'm saying?
And I would agree with you. And I think that people do the same thing with Wu-Tang. They'll take them as a group and put them against other hip hop groups, but then they want to separate them and go, well, who is the best in this group?
Right.
Or the same with Tribe Called Quest, or you know what I mean? And I think there's always people also want to search for the star, who had the coldest lines, who have the coldest raps, who is, memorizing their stuff and can give it to you backwards and forwards without writing it down on paper. This is how they get judged, Let me ask you this. So you talked about, there's a starting point. Is there an ending point with the rise of the hip hop South? Because now we have Migos. We have, so many of the other, I guess some people would call them millennial rappers or.
No. This Generation Z and up.
Okay, Z. I forget. I always get mixed up. Like, who's after the millennials?
I'm a millennial.
Okay.
Millennial. You know what I mean? It's fascinating how millennials be like, we're sick of y'all because it's like because like when folks I'm not saying this is what you were doing, but it's just like it makes me laugh because it's like when folks have conversations about millennials, it's almost like folks forget that we were born in the early 80s. Like that's when the millennials start.
We do forget. You know why? Because those of us who are educators are teaching some of these young people. And we don't know. Some of them don't mind being called in their generation, and we discuss it. And some of them are highly offended. And they're like, no, don't call me I'm not a Gen Z. I'm not a millennial. But just for the sake of place. In other words, if you were to interview Migos, would you ask them, so who were the Southern rappers that you looked up to, or who did you model yourself after, or who were your mentors? I would be really interested to know who they looked up to.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of if you think about the cadence of Amigos, you know what I mean? You can trace that back to, or even a Young Thug, you can trace that back to an Andre or a CeeLo Green. You know what I mean? I think, you were talking about like Migos. I mean, like even folks like, Lil Baby, for example, it's interesting how Atlanta continues to evolve. I don't think there's a cutoff point for the ways that the South evolves in hip hop culture because we're consistently revising ourselves. We're consistently, you know what I'm saying, remixing who we are. And the South is starting to extend a little bit, you know what I'm saying, in terms, you know, who's included in that conversation. So for example, I saw that, you know, one of my favorite rappers is in the chat, Thomas Who, right? And he's from Oklahoma City, you know what I mean? But folks never think about Oklahoma as being part of anybody's culture, let alone in the South. But if you listen to Oklahoma hip hop, right? You hear the pieces from Texas, you hear the pieces from Louisiana, you hear the pieces from California. And I think the way that Southernness presents itself now is more so sonic than just regional. So like one of the things that I talk about in the book is a distinction between Southernness and Southness, right? And Southness is the action in itself, whereas Southernness is the culture and Southernness is mobile. Yeah. Because if it wasn't, you wouldn't have a lot of these influences. Like it makes me think about the Great Migration in the early 20th century. You know what I'm saying? And you have these Black folks who are leaving the South, who are going to these different places, and they're not leaving as empty vessels. They're leaving with their culture, with the slang. So it's like, you know, it's not a joke when folks say somewhere like Chicago, for example, is up South. Because you hear the influence, you know what I mean? Yes. You hear that. So I think we're at a point now where it's not the Great Migration, it's the Great Reverse Migration. Wow. Because folks are coming back South. Folks are coming back home. You know what I mean? True. Like there is a sense of familiarity that is there. And it's historically based. Like I think that's one of the things that makes Southerners stand out from the rest of the country is that the South unapologetically grapples with history. You know what I'm saying? It grapples with history in a way.
Would you say more than other regions?
More than other regions in the sense that our identity is based in our history. When folks think the South, they either think the Confederacy or they think slavery. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, it's something that we are consistently grappling with in ways that other regions might not have to in the same way. You know what I'm saying? Like the South is literally one of the main staples of the South is tourism. Where's that tourism coming from? Plantations, folks getting married at plantations, folks going to visit plantations. You know,
the food, right? The food.
Yeah. I mean, like food, culinary, you know what I'm saying? But what's interesting is that even though the people in the South move forward, you know what I'm saying? The language to discuss us and even just our perspectives about being Southern are not part of the conversation. Everybody wants to tell us what it means to be Southern, but Southerners, you know what I mean? Right. And there are multiple receipts from the folks who are like, well, you know, the reason that it's Trump like this is because of the South. No, don't do us. Don't do us. Right. Or the reason that, you know, President Biden got elected. Well, you have to look at the South. You have to look at the grassroots and the organizers. But it's like, you can't say that we're the reason that it's fallen and also the reason that we saved America. You know what I'm saying?
You make a powerful point. In other words, you know, don't blame us for all the ish that goes wrong. And then on the back end, laud us for saving the mess. Because that's literally what happened in this past year. Yeah.
Oh, well, it's the Southerners' fault. And then I also want to be like, further. What white Southerners do is hella different than what Black Southerners be doing. Okay. But there is this idea that is so deeply rooted in popular culture that whatever white Southerners do, Black folks just kind of fall into the shadow. And like, if you talk to any Black Southerners, you know what I mean? We're going to tell you, no, we're going to do our own thing. You know,
but let me ask you this. But Dr. Bradley, are you speaking of Atlanta? Because we often separate Atlanta from that because you have
to.
We think of Atlanta as a Black universe, by the way, that's self-sufficient.
I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, though, because for some folks, Atlanta is a Black hole, especially if you're from Georgia. It's like if you're from outside of the perimeter, if you're from somewhere like I'm from, which is Southwest Georgia, you know what I'm saying? Life is different than what's happening in Atlanta. But if you want to be recognized as Georgian and recognized as Southern in a particular way, especially in pop music, you have to go to Atlanta. Okay. You know what I'm saying? Right. So it's like, yeah, it's its own thing, but at some points, it's like it's also a Black hole. Everything has to like be consumed by that. You know what I'm saying? But I think that, but the other thing too is like, you know, if we think about the dynamics, right? And this is why I really, and this is what I kind of talk about in the book with, like, you know, Kiese Layman's work and Jasmine Ward, you know what I'm saying?
Jasmine Ward, yeah.
Yeah. Besides them being ridiculously talented authors, they are also unapologetically rooted in their articulation of the South, right? So Kiese is like central Mississippi, you know what I'm saying? Jasmine is more coastal Mississippi, but they are unapologetically Black. Like, they don't shy away from, one, the history of Mississippi and the influence of what that is in terms of how we think about Black folks, but also it introduces the possibility of a modern South in these spaces that are blocked in, but like a rock and a hard place between history. When you think about Mississippi, you don't think about contemporary Mississippi. It's always Confederate Mississippi.
It's back. We think back about the worst parts of the history in that region. Yes.
Yeah. Right. And I'm like, and it's traumatic. There's so much pain that's there that we don't, you know, it's like, okay, well, if there was pain in the past, so like folks are using Richard Wright to read Kiese, or they're using somebody like Faulkner to read Jasmine Ward. But the challenge with some of these older authors that folks look up to and are comfortable with, let's not forget comfort. You know what I'm saying? Don't speak to the more contemporary moments that these authors are talking about in their work, simply for the fact that we don't know how to absorb and understand a contemporary moment.
True.
That makes us scary. You know what I mean? It's easier to blame Southern Black folks instead of actually engage us and have these conversations about what has shifted and what has changed since these major historical moments. But that means that you have to do the work. And a lot of folks don't want to do the work. They would rather just, you know, kind of let it happen as it may.
And with that point that you made, in thinking about your research, OutKast and T.I. and, you know, all of these artists, even, you know, Ludacris and Jermaine, do you feel like Southern artists have had more of a hurdle in getting their stories and voices out than, say, the Queens rapper, Brooklyn rapper, Bronx rapper, even the West Coast folks? Are you saying that Southern rappers carry history, Black history from the South on their backs, and that gives them a lot more of a challenge in breaking through into the mainstream and being considered as impacting hip hop culture, because they're still struggling with the history down there of the Jim Crow South, of segregation and all of these things?
So more contemporary artists, no. Because I feel like we got social media now. So if you want to break through as an artist, you don't necessarily have to grapple with those things. Previous generations of Southern rappers, yeah. I feel like, you know, a lot of us are still in, I mean, I've said this repeatedly, that a lot of us are still in the long shadow of the civil rights movement, right? And especially those of us who came up in the 80s and the 90s, were in that immediate aftermath of it, that, one, we're being told not to question what wasn't taken care of during the civil rights movement. Like, there's no room for us to articulate what that new landscape looks like for us. So of course we have to push back. So there's friction there. But that, on top of the biases and the stigmas that are still associated with Southerners from non-Southern perspectives, it was an uphill challenge. You know what I'm saying? There's a reason that OutKast gets booed at the 95 Source Awards. It's not because their lyrics wasn't dope. It's just because we can't understand what they're saying. We don't understand what's going through.
I was going to say they were misunderstood. And our mindset was so on the sounds of New York. And I think people who wanted hip hop were prejudiced against the Southern sounds and the Southern artists. They weren't necessarily talking about, you know, shooting and robbing, and they weren't necessarily talking about get paid, balling out of control either.
Oh, no. They were. I think there was some folks. UGK was talking that good shit though, Doc.
well, I'm thinking about OutKast. I'm thinking about, you know,
they did. Like they think about these things. I think the distinction is that they were talking about these things in a city that they didn't think was a legit city. They didn't think it's just a small rural town, right? So like when Organized Noise and So Def and LaFace come out with these artists like Goody Mob and you know, let me back it up a little bit. So when LaFace comes to Atlanta in the early 1990s. The expectation is that they're coming for like what folks call the linen music, right? Like linen parties. So
Okay.
like Tony Braxton's, the Ushers, you TLCs, you know what I'm
Sure.
saying? They weren't checking for a hip hop sound because they felt like that, like you were saying, that's something that's coming out of New York. So when Organized Noise puts OutKast on the LaFace Christmas compilation album, then they're like, oh, well, maybe this might be a thing. That makes room, you know what I'm saying? But they're not even the only ones who are doing it. If you're going to, you know, Rap a Lot, that's happening out in Texas, or Swisher House.
True.
I mean,
Scarface and
yeah,
all them. Yeah.
you know what I mean? And is they're also speaking to these things, but it's like, oh, we're still making it ours. So by the time that you get to the late 90s, and OutKast is already kind of still on its rising star, you have the introduction of, you know, No Limit in the early and mid 90s with Master P, you know what I mean? Who is talking about those things like losing folks and murder and death and drugs.
Dr. Bradley, I love that documentary that they showed on BET. I wanted more of that.
No Limit was so good. I was, you know,
it was fascinating, really.
Yeah.
I didn't know he had that much impact. Seeing that, you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Other people saying, oh yeah, because of what No Limit and Master P did, I was able to do this. He even went out to the West Coast and showed some of those artists how to do their own self-promotion thing. And I'm like, whoa, that's heavy.
Yeah, he had ties to the Bay Area artists, you know what I'm saying? And there's a reason that the Bay Area artists are such in so many collaborations with Southern artists, right? But it's like you have No Limit, and then you have LaFace, you know, and then you have Cash Money at the end of the 90s.
All right.
Is
Juvenile
era. You know, like not only did they, you know, take over for the 99 and 2000, but they introduced the bling era in hip hop, right? And it's like, I'm gonna be decked out in all the diamonds and all the, you know, spinning rims and all of these things. So I just think that it was establishing a pulse point for how the South was handling this idea of hip hop that shifted away from New York. You know what I'm saying?
But what's interesting, Dr. Bradley, when I think about New York hip hop, and I go back to, you know, when I was first listening to hip hop, and I'm thinking about, you know, the rappers that are talking about Black history, that are talking about education, KRS-One, and all these different groups, they were concerned, it seemed like, with community building, upliftment. Did New York start so much different in terms of being rooted in Black cultural consciousness than Southern hip hop? And did Southern hip hop artists feel like, well, that's already been done, we don't want to keep, you know, bringing that back up in terms of history? Do you feel that Southern artists felt, I mean, you know, OutKast has touched on, you know, those community things, and I know that Goody Mob discussed some things back early on. But then, as you mentioned, it seemed like a lot of the regions, it all kind of converged into what I call bling hip hop, living a certain lifestyle, establishing and realizing perhaps the type of wealth and access that your parents and grandparents did not and never dreamed of. And so the conversation or the subject matter and the themes is so much different than what was being discussed in the 80s or even the early 90s, you know, 90, 91, 92. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's fair to say that, you know, a lot of folks like to talk about this distinction between conscious rap and commercial rap, right? And I think I think that there's a little, I mean, like, it's going to blend regardless, right? Like folks like to try to be purists, so to speak, and be like, oh, well, the real rap only talks about the issues. And I'm like, money is the issue. We live in a capitalistic society.
Trendy. Well, that's why I didn't say real rap, though, Dr. Bradley. But I'm bringing it up because it is things that people have discussed, you know.
Yeah, and rightfully so. Like, we live in a capitalistic society. Why wouldn't we talk about getting bread and keeping it? You know what I'm saying? I think the challenge is becoming hyper capitalistic, hyper commercialized, right? And some folks could point to the, you know, Cash Money in the early 2000s as contributing to that. But I also, you know, on top of that, when the South starts to shift and become like center to hip hop and not just on the margins, New York folks felt like they had to keep up. I know they ain't gonna like me saying that, but it's true. It's like, oh,
Fine
so
with me.
shift in what folks are thinking is and is not hip hop. So it's like, okay, you're gonna have your greats. Like I'm still waiting on somebody to write the paper about how Jay-Z is connected to Southern rap. Because it introduced a different era for him. It ushered him into a different
Yeah.
set, you know what I'm saying?
And you know, I don't know a whole lot about that, but I do know when his sound changed. And I remember there being a discussion on, is that Jay-Z? Who's
Right.
influencing him? He sounds more like a Southern rapper. But, you know, yes, I do remember that discussion some years ago. And it was like, you heard him and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like Jay.
You got to change to keep playing. You know, you got to pay to play, so to speak. And he recognized that there was a lot of emphasis on the South. You know what I mean? And that really pissed off a lot of New Yorkers who were like, "No, it needs to stay New York." You know what I'm saying? But it was almost grasping at straws. But I even think like even the South opened up the possibility of what these other regions can do. You know what I'm saying? Because at the same time, the South was coming into their own. The Midwest was coming into their own with Twista and Bone Thugs and Harmony and all of these folks.
Right.
Who also were pulling from similar roots as the South, especially if you think about the connection to funk. You know what I'm saying? You can't talk about funk and not talk about Ohio. You know what I mean? So I just think that, you know, it's, you know, what happens when you lose the crown, so to speak, right? And the thing is that folks have been waiting on the South to drop off since 1995.
True indeed.
We ain't going nowhere.
It ain't happened. Right. That's why I asked you, does the rise continue? Is there a stopping point? Do we look at the current artists and go, okay, they're in the legacy, they're in the lineage? Because now it doesn't seem as important for these artists to rep their city or their region like it used to be. Now, I mean, these people are worldwide.
Right.
Hip hop culture is now like everyone's culture, where it used to, you know what I mean? It used to just be, it was tagged as, that's urban. This is urban music over here. No, this is suburban. It's everybody's music now. All the kids are listening to it and want to dress like it and look like it and sound like it, no matter where they're from. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, does Southern hip hop remain in its form and genre if it no longer has to yell, I'm from the South, I'm from Atlanta? You know, like they don't have to do that now. The gate has been fully open, full acceptance. As I mentioned, I'm just saying Migos because I hear them all the time, and I like that song Straightening. That's my joint now lately. So that's why but I know there are others. I'm just using them because they're so, you know, they're all over the place now. And you don't think of them as, oh, that's Southern hip hop. Oh, that's Georgia. No, you don't. You just think these are some talented young brothers, and they are very popular. And as you mentioned, social media has only helped them and other artists, you know, in recent years to really, sky is the limit on what they do and where they can go.
Yeah, I think you kind of nailed it. Is because we're in this era of social media, we have such immediate access to everybody, right? That there's not necessarily a need to identify, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier about Southernness. There's still a distinction in Southern artists that you can hear the distinction, how they I mean, like beyond how they talk, but I mean, like this just the vibe, so to speak. I don't know how else to put it. The vibe folks have. I mean, like Southerners carry themselves in a particular way that you can immediately be like, oh yeah, they got Southern connections, you know, they got Southern roots, right? But I think too, what's ending up happening is we're in a really interesting moment that a lot of the new artists who are coming from the South are women. And because women, from Meg to City Girls to Big Lotto to
right.
All of these folks, there is an uneasiness in being like, oh yeah, that's Southern, because now it's a woman telling you what it means to
be. And they're coming through like gangbusters, unapologetic, and they taking over. They've already taken over.
Yeah, and it makes folks uncomfortable. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, like, you know, I think that's part of it is, and this is something I'm playing around with for the second book project, right? Is like, what happens if you center Black women in these conversations about Southern hip hop? How does the conversation shift? It's just
so necessary. And, you know, Meg Thee Stallion has mentioned that in interviews, that she feels that she is a threat to, unfortunately, you know, it becomes a gender thing, not just race, but now it's gender.
Mm-hmm.
She talked about, because of the things I talk about, you know, I'm like, but it's so interesting. Many of the men who may be supporting or listening to her music, I'm like, but they're used to this culture. You always hear, you know, in Atlanta, the strip club is like going to the barber shop, or it is just like going to get some hot wings from, I don't know, your favorite restaurant. It's not a big deal. So I'm thinking, well, who are these men that are so offended by her when this is so entrenched in our culture now?
So I think it's two things. The first thing is that what's so wonderful about this younger crop of young women MCs is that they don't censor men about how they talk about sex.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And when we think about, and I'm like you said, it's not like sex isn't something new, but it's also like they're in a larger tradition, right? I mean, like, it's such a complicated question when we think about sex in Southern Black women, because they're supposed to be ladylike, and Black women ain't supposed to talk about openly. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's like, here
I
you
appreciate you saying that. So what makes this an issue?
This
These ladies are from the South.
It makes it an issue, one, because, you know, Black women are supposed to be, you know, seen and participate sexually and not heard, but also they are pushing away from a centering of men in what that sexual pleasure looks like. So it's hurt feelings. I mean, like, it really comes down to hurt feelings. So Meg talking about sexual pleasure, talking about going to the strip club and having the dancers dance just for her. You know what I'm saying? There's no what men will think about that. And a lot of men get in their feelings about it and be like, oh, okay, well, that's just being hoish. You know what I'm saying? But if
let me ask you, is this generational? Because it seems that no. So in other words,
I just think that it's more amplified because we're in social media. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, got you.
That Meg was the same way that folks was coming at Trina. It's the same way that folks was coming at Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and all of these folks who are like, I'm going to talk about sex. I'm going to talk about sex, and you're just going to have to deal with it.
And how about also, I find it interesting with Meg Thee Stallion, also Cardi B and other. I know Cardi B is not considered Southern, but I'm just thinking about.
She got Caribbean roots. That's the global South. She's Southern by
right. What I also want to say, not just sex, but also money. The way they discuss money, transaction, being paid for their talent, their time, their skill, their energy, their beauty. They discuss that a lot as well. And I find that very refreshing. They're not just saying, I'm independent, I don't need a man. What they're saying is, I make my own money, and therefore I am also calling the shots in my life. And you don't tell me who I am, my identity, or my worth or value, because I've already decided my value in general.
Period.
Period.
You
know, and I feel like these young women are all doing that across the board. As you mentioned, city girls. I love city girls. I feel like they're my, you know, if I could have an alter ego, it's city girl. I mean, city girl scholar. How about that?
You know, it's out there. I also just think, too, to kind of continue to build off of that, is the disregard for men in terms of what they think. That just further pisses them off, right? It goes against this conditioning that so many Southern Black women and girls go through, which is, you know, you're supposed to be ladylike. Like, I hate that term, ladylike.
But what's so interesting, supposed to be ladylike, and by the way, all women go through that. Women in the Midwest, in the North, go through, I feel like particularly with Black women, there's something that is like a stronghold placed on us that is constantly trying to make us change or conform with our hair, our beauty, the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we express ourselves. It's like it's everywhere, and it's like, good gracious, can't y'all take your hands off us for a second?
Yeah.
What are you afraid? What are you so afraid of?
Black women taking up space. If we take up space, there's a fear that, you know, that's gonna cause something. I mean, like, there's nothing as scary as a self-confident and self-autonomous Black woman.
But the other thing is, so then if these women rappers were to cover up, change their lyrics, discuss XYZ, so then what do they get? Because what I hear on the flip side is their men as their counterparts
out. They're still gonna find something to bitch about, and that,
right,
and
because I'm like, okay,
well,
well, they're not necessarily wanting to marry a partner and commit to these women either, even when they're not presenting this persona. So then what are y'all talking about? Because even the church girls get mistreated and get marginalized. Even the conservative or the, you know, I stopped reading certain magazines because every other issue it was, why are Black women so single? Like, shut up. I mean, what do you know? So the respectability, like, what are y'all talking about? Because it's not cherished, valued, or rewarded anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think I agree with everything that you said. I think the other part of it too is that Black women's loneliness is also profitable now, right? Like, you have so many folks who have ministries that are like, this is what you do to get married. There aren't enough ministries that talk about how to stay married. You know what I'm saying? It's just how to get married. It's not what, you know what I'm saying? It's like, that's
Yes.
like work.
Yeah, they have wife school now. They have
right.
wife school now.
And then you say you have wife school and you're not actually talking to wives who've been married for 6 months, 6 years, 60 years. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I have thoughts about that. But I think ultimately, you know, it makes me think about somebody like Tracy Sharpley Whiting. And she had this book she came out with back in 2008. It's called Pimps Up and Hoes Down, right? And she's like, the whole that it is that for a lot of artists, a lot of male artists, there's a need to have a woman's gaze, have something to claim, ownership, right? So like, if that ownership shifts to a woman and she's like, I own myself, like, you don't get to tell me what to do, then that completely turns it on its ear. So what am I going to do? I'm going to try to find ways to bring you back down the side, so to speak.
Wow.
So we've been talking about Meg, right? So you have Tory Lanez, who is out here being the biggest punk I've ever, you know what I'm saying, I've ever seen, but yet he's like, oh, she was like, I ain't want to rock with you like that no more. So his feelings were hurt. Because his feelings were hurt, what does he do? He shoots her.
Allegedly.
Yeah, okay.
Please.
Allegedly. But it's like, and then on top of that, but yet you're making music that's like a what if about what allegedly happened that night. And I'm like, but yet you're trying to tell me that that's not what was going on. But it was still like, because she didn't want to rock with you like that, or she was too tall. Somebody told me that she was too tall. And I'm like,
yeah. I'm
6'1". A bullet's not going to save me. My height's not going to save me from being shot. You know what I'm saying? But then it was like, it was amazing to me how many folks were like trying to be like, oh, well, you need to think about it from his perspective too. What does she do? What does she do to deserve to be traumatized like
True.
this?
There you go.
And
so
I'm
then
like,
what we're talking about is his male ego against her safety.
Yeah.
Against her. Wait.
Yeah.
Make it make sense.
So the ego is supposed to be more important than a woman's safety, and you're like, this is where it all gets jacked up. And then the flip side of that, moving away from women, you have somebody like Lil Nas X, who's from Linden Springs, Georgia, which is right outside of Atlanta. You know what I'm saying? And he's unapologetic in his sexuality and who he is. He's an amazing marketer, by the way. And the discomfort that people have in that they are trying to, the discomfort with him that they're trying to dress as concern for children. And I'm like, what? What about the children? What about them? He didn't say he was a children's song.
No, he didn't. And he's right.
Multiple times he's said that. That is something that we have imposed on him. And he has consistently been like, no. So instead you have folks like, oh, now there's a gay agenda, right? And I'm like, well, if the gay agenda is him donating his money and royalties to community activist organizations, then let the gay agenda go on. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm like,
right.
It's just really kind of fascinating that as people find hip hop as a space to fully articulate their entire selves, not just what they think will get them $1, but their entire selves, which is what a lot of these younger artists are starting to do, that makes people uncomfortable because it goes against the status quo. You know what I'm saying? And
agreed.
We have to be willing to change the status quo, because if we don't do it, willingly, it's going to be forcefully done, and it's going to hurt trying to, recognize what the new status quo is. So why not just what that is. Yeah.
Luckily, artists are known to break barriers and to do things to, I mean, look at Prince, you know, R.I.P. Look at Michael Jackson. I mean, there were people that didn't agree with the things, with their image all the time, or the way they dress, or the way they, but they literally changed culture and changed music forever, you know. Chuck Berry, James Brown, they literally changed music forever, culture, the way we think about music and the way we think about rock and roll. And it's, so it's like no different, you know.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Bradley, let me ask you, because I really enjoyed, in addition to your chronicling Stankonia, I also enjoyed your storytelling of your own life, your family, and your connection to music and culture, and even how you discuss, you know, attending school and the kids saying something about the way you talked, and you learning certain things about the culture in that part. And it's like, I could really relate to that, you know, having been from New York, and then we moved to the Midwest, and, you know, kids thought I was weird. And I mean, now I sound like a Midwesterner, but I can remember feeling out of place, out of sorts. And as I got older, you know, my identities merged. But, you know, how important was it for you to talk about your own transformation, transition in terms of language and culture and things like that?
I couldn't say about how the South changed with hip hop, and I lived in the South, and hip hop changed the South for me. I just felt like it was a touchstone for folks who were like, instead of making it theory that was inaccessible, I just felt like using personal vignettes, I guess, to talk about, you know, these particular experiences that helped me recognize my Southernness, and how hip hop soundtrack for that was easier to lure the reader in than me trying to throw out, you know, a whole lot of academic jargon and theory. But the other part of it too is that there's very little theory about contemporary Southern Black folks. So it was almost like I was making up theory as I was going.
Wow.
To be like, oh, okay, this is what it actually can do, and this is what it looks like. So yeah, I mean, like it was a touchstone for me to stay on track with what I was trying to say, but it was also kind of a show and prove, like, oh, you're just saying that. And I'm like, no, I actually lived it.
No, I can back it up. I have receipts.
Yep.
And so is this a framework? You mentioned thinking about future works, and I know you have your anthology on OutKast Reader. Congratulations on that, by the way. Do you now feel, as you mentioned, making up theory as you were going along, that you have a framework from which you can work now in discussing hip hop history and what we're seeing now in the present? Will you kind of, you know what I mean? In other words, you've got a foundation now with what you're doing.
I think I got a foundation. I think I'm more excited to see the door that's been open for other scholars to kind of come in and speak to the South, because I don't want to be the only one. I can't be the only one. The South is such a dynamic space that it needs multiple voices to speak to it. And being able to write this book, I feel, has opened the door, and I'm really excited to see the type of scholarship that's coming through to continue this conversation that I've helped to start.
Amazing. Well, you're certainly a leader in hip hop scholarship, and you know, I'll be so excited to see what else you have in the works coming up. And just please tell us how we can best support you, where we can purchase and find your book, Chronicling Stankonia, Rise of the Hip Hop South, as well as the OutKast Reader.
Oh, so I don't do Amazon like that, but I mean, like, okay, it's everywhere. So I've been telling folks to go to their local independent bookstore. Bonus points if it's Black owned. It's out. It's pretty much anywhere. The OutKast Reader actually comes out on Friday, the 1st.
Oh, wow.
So it's, yeah, so I'm excited. I'm excited about that. And that is basically, I had the privilege of being able to edit scholarship on OutKast from some of the most dynamic scholars in the field of hip hop studies, and across interdisciplinaries. You can't talk about OutKast and not have interdisciplinary analysis. But that, I mean, like, that's it. And I just really want to thank the folks who are here and also who are listening. That I very much appreciate you taking the time to read my work, because no academic takes that for granted, right? And like, you know, being able to share the work and for it to resonate the way that it has done such a service to my soul, so to speak. But also, I just hope that folks feel seen in my writing, right? Like, folks feel seen if they grew up in the South or outside of New York and hip hop was a significant part of their growing up. So I just hope that they felt seen, and it was like a love note to us. You know what I'm saying? That, you know, if the South had something to say, then it's what I ended the book with, which is the South still got something to say. And I'm really excited to see who's saying what and how that's coming up next.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Regina Bradley. And Dr. Bradley, what is your website again? Is it Red Clay Scholar?
Redclayscholar.com. Yep.
Scholar.com. So I'm going to put that in here. And folks can definitely go to that. And you can be booked for different speaking engagements. I got an email actually from, I don't know if it was Macmillan or NCTE or something, that you were doing the HBCU English Symposium.
This year. That was we had that conversation last Friday. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, awesome. That's really wonderful. I was excited to see that too. Well, thank you so much for joining me on Nerdacity Podcast. And Dr. Bradley, with your permission, I'll keep this live up for a while on IG.
Okay.
For folks to watch the playback of it. And please visit redclayscholar.com. Support Dr. Bradley's work. Her new book, Chronicling Stankonia, Rise of the Hip Hop South, is out. And this Friday, OutKast Reader will be out. And thank you again. It was a pleasure talking with you and meeting you today.
Likewise.
Dr. Bradley.
Opportunity.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great day.
Good night.
Good night.